that I have been given this privilege of delivering this address in his presence is particularly special. As Professor Shija mentioned, India is at a crossroads, and the significance, in a sense, of of India being at a crossroad was also brought out by Professor Mazumdar's description about the situation that exists, and that basically that we are still a long way away from reaching a status of being a developed nation, even in purely economic terms. And of course, if you take into account what Professor Roman said, development is a much wider concept. We are still a long way away from there. Professor Roman also, in his presentation, highlighted not just the economic but also the socio-political realities with which economic realities are interacting. And if India is at a crossroads, it's in the sense of this totality and how socio-political realities will influence the economy and the economy will influence the other way around. This is the process by which will be settled from these crossroads, where do we actually go. But I think the conditions that prevail today are such that this is not a small question about which direction India is going to go in the future, given the pathways that it is presently on. And that's essentially what I'd like to cover in my presentation today, which essentially is trying to look at where we are currently standing, keeping in mind that India is presently located at a particular point of time in its own development history. Within that history, the last 35 years has been a process where India has been inserted into a process of globalization. That has also run a course of, the process at the global level has run a course and is itself confronting a new emergent reality at the world level. And India too, in its participation, has had specific pattern or trajectory of development, some of whose characteristics or inherent characteristics have been revealed by the particular patterns that we see in the last decade and a half or so. So roughly from 2011-12 onwards, if one sees, there are specific patterns to see in India's economic development trajectory, which is what I wish to highlight as indicators of what the current position is. The other way around, this one. Yeah. So this is just a brief summary of what I would like to present, and the rest of the presentation will be basically presenting the evidence in support of these basic propositions. The first is that Indian growth, if it is happening, is somewhat unique in relation to general historical experience. So when you think of economic growth in terms of theory, in terms of historical evidence, you think of growth as being a process driven by certain engines. But almost all the engines of growth that one knows of, as far as India's economy is concerned, as I use the term, missing in action. Okay. Indian growth is not industrialization driven. Indian growth is not trade driven. Indian growth is not investment driven. None of these engines seem to be working. So what is the engine driving Indian growth? Itself is a bit of a question or a bit of a mystery. Okay. The second is, but what we do know, is that we do have a condition where persistently you have a situation of extreme inequality in the distribution of income and wealth. Okay. And one can look at it as one in which the growth process is both creating this inequality in distribution of income and wealth, and at the same time the growth process is itself being influenced by that same inequality and distribution of income and wealth. So you have inequality because of the fact that large proportion of the Indian population, which is primarily dependent on work, is the growth process is not able to generate conditions where there is significant employment opportunities for them, and so therefore they suffer from mass unemployment and underemployment, and also low earnings from or low returns from that work. Even if they work very hard, the returns to that labor are extremely low. So bulk of the benefits of that growth goes to those in whose hands the wealth of the economy is concentrated, not to those who work. But the accumulation of wealth of this top 10% of the Indian population and the demand patterns generated by their growth of income are not feeding back into the economy in a way which would address the problem of unemployment in that case. Instead, it is leading to a persistence of this particular reality. So in a new form, the vicious cycle of poverty is working in India for at least 90% of the population. It's working differently for the top 10%, but for 90% of the population, this is the pattern that you get. What you also see is what I describe as a growing contradiction between capital accumulation and employment growth. So one problem is that the growth pattern is one in which the accumulation of wealth of the top 10% is not taking the form of productive capital accumulation. If it did, then the engine of investment would be working. It's not working. Even when capital accumulation takes place, it is taking place under conditions where capital accumulation, a significant part of capital accumulation, is not growth creating but employment creating but employment replacing. Okay, and it's a very peculiar kind of historical condition, I think, that has emerged where this kind of a process is at work, and it's a reflection of a larger global context. So therefore, when you do get growth of employment, as official statistics are supposedly indicating now, this is not a growth of employment that is associated with production growth. So production growth is taking place somewhere, earnings growth is taking place somewhere, employment growth is taking place somewhere, some other part of the economy. Okay, it's not where that growth is happening. So therefore, it's not even if you get a growth of employment, that growth of employment doesn't mean growth of earnings from that particular employment. And therefore, you are getting a pattern of structural change in India's economy, where you have this specific combination of premature deindustrialization, that before an economy is industrialized, it has already started deindustrializing. And in addition to that, when you look at the employment structure of the economy, that also seems to be going in the opposite direction of what historically one knows to be the pattern of change when economies grow and develop over time. So these are all features of India's development which appear very clearly to be patterns that you see in the last, since the beginning of the second decade of this century. Very clear patterns that you see of this kind. And one of the symptoms of the crisis of the Indian economy is that in most official policy discourses and discussions, there isn't even a recognition of all these particular patterns and trends. So let me now present what I think is pretty clinching evidence that these are all features of India's development trajectory. So as far as growth itself is concerned, of course we have this narrative of India being a relatively good performing economy in the world, to do better relatively than most other parts of the world because it is growing faster. So this growth, of course, is so in the period before the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a phenomena where all the world's developing economies, so were growing suddenly started growing very rapidly for a period of about 5 years. that preceded the 2008 global crisis. India also experienced in that time period growth rates of a kind that had never been seen in our history. One of the problems with being a large country is we often think that whatever is happening to us is special to us. It wasn't special. And in most analysis of why India certainly started growing at such a rapid rate for that period of time, you have very little reference to what is happening in the global economy, even though the evidence is quite clear that India was following a global trend, okay, which is that developing countries started growing very fast and the gap between their growth rates and that of the developed economies increased. Even though the United States was the driver of that particular process of growth, there was this gap that increased. When the 2008 crisis happened, India followed the pattern, growth slowed down. After the 2008 crisis, everyone assumed or presumed that countries like India and China would be able to lead the world economy out of that crisis. But that didn't prove to be the case, and overall the world growth itself slowed down. Since then, bulk of the world's developing countries also have been growing more slowly than they did during that period. And until the 2015, the new Indian GDP series came, India seemed to be following the global pattern. And then there was this, the new GDP series suddenly changed the levels of growth that India was experiencing, and India diverges from the global trend for a period of time. But even that series was not able to keep India at that level. Okay. Post demonetization, introduction of GST, you have India's growth rates being dragged down to the same average that was prevailing in the developing countries as a whole. When the COVID crisis happens, one of the biggest drops happens in India. And of course, the base effect of that drop elevates the India's growth rate in the period after. So again, you are appearing to be a faster growing economy. There is an additional problem that has come in the recent past with regard to the calculations of India's growth, which we see in the last year. So if you look at the period since the demonetization of 2016, the students would know that if you look at the nominal growth of GDP, there is two parts. One part which is the increase in prices, the other part is the increase in the real output. So if you look at the breakup between these two, you see that a consistent trend where the real output growth part was coming down, whereas the price component was increasing, okay, in India's nominal GDP growth. So the rate of percentage increase in prices was going up from period to period. That of real output was coming down. Last year, the last year, full year for which we have data, which is 23-24, with 23-24, we suddenly have again an 8.2% growth of real GDP. But that is based on a calculation where the nominal rate of growth of GDP is just 9.6%, which means that the implicit rate of inflation as far as GDP is concerned is just 1.4%. In that same year, from February of 2023, okay, I mean, throughout 22-23, the RBI increased its repo rate steadily from 4% to in 6.5% in February 2023. And till date, that's the repo rate that has been maintained by the RBI. Okay. Now, either of two things must be the case. Either in the Indian economy, the inflation rate is actually higher than what is being presumed as the basis for calculation of real GDP growth, or the RBI is mad at keeping in real interest rates at such a high level. So if real interest rates are being kept by RBI at such a high level, how are you getting high real GDP growth rate? If you think that the interest rate matters in determining the growth rate, how do you get high GDP growth with such high real interest rates? The problem is that the methods being used to deflate the nominal figures in this GDP series, there are issues. I'm not saying that it's a conspiracy, but at least one should recognize that there is a problem and therefore not conclude from this simple calculation that this is an accurate picture of what is really happening as far as India's economy is concerned. So if you take the consumer price inflation, index-based inflation rate, which is about 6%, if you take that as the basis, India's real GDP growth instead of 8.2 would be under 4%. So where between less than 4% and 8.2% is India's actual GDP growth? That's a mystery that no one wants to solve because 8.2% is good news. And the first quarter figures that you see for 24-25, same story. Nominal growth rate is less than 10% or just above 10%. Real growth is significantly higher. Now, this growth is of course in the context of an economy which only made it to the lower middle income status amongst the world's economies in 2007. And while we have ambitions of becoming a high income economy, we are still, despite all this, based on this GDP calculations, what's the real growth of per capita GDP that has happened, even then you see that compared to where we would need to be to become upper middle income, we are just about halfway there. So half the distance is still to be traversed, and in relation to high income, we are not even a fifth of that high income level threshold that the World Bank uses to classify countries as high income, upper middle, lower middle income and low income. So we are still in lower middle income category and still within the bottom half of the lower middle income category. So if you look at the world itself, all this growth, what has it done to change India's even relative position in terms of per capita GDP in the world? You see that there's not much that has changed over the last 30 years. So the bottom panel is based on the gross national income per capita of different countries in 91. The upper part is in 2021. So 30 years difference. So the dark green indicates the high income economies of the world, and you can see that most of the high income parts of the world have remained the same. They have not changed. If you look at Latin America and Africa, there's not much dramatic change that has happened. Latin America, some parts have gone from upper middle income to lower middle income to upper middle income. Africa has remained more or less where it was in terms of this classification. If you look at Asia, India has just followed a general pattern. All of South Asia has gone from lower income to lower middle income. But if you look at other parts of Asia, East and Southeast Asia, they have gone much further. Okay, they are mostly now in upper middle income category, with China of course being the big dramatic change here. So in terms of the relative position of India's economy in the world, at least in terms of this indicator per capita, nothing much has changed over these last 30 years. But what has changed? Okay, and this is where India is amongst the world's leaders, is the increase in inequality. So this 30-year period has been a period in which worldwide there has been an increase in inequality in the distribution of income within countries. So every part of the world you see has gone from, so yellow is the least unequal, there is the lowest share of the top 10% in national income. Okay, and the dark red is the highest share of the top 10%. Okay, so most parts of the world, the colors have gone in the movement from yellow to red upwards, towards red. But India has gone from the second shade of yellow to the darkest red. So the highest, one of the highest increases in inequality in this period has taken place in India. Now what this means is, it's only in relation to that one should understand the meaning of this growth. Okay. Because if you're already an economy in which, in terms of international comparisons of per capita GDP, India is on the wrong side of global inequality. And in its own economy, 90% of its population is on the wrong side of the internal inequality. So 90% of India's population's own per capita, average per capita income level is, if you look at it globally, amongst the lowest. Because it's caught on the wrong side of both inequalities. And this second inequality is something that has increased significantly during this particular period. And this is summary of what that level of inequality is. So top 10% of the population gets almost 58% of India's national income. Okay, and the rest manage with the remaining 42%. Okay. So this is the extremely high level of inequality that exists in India's distribution of income. There's also a second aspect to this inequality which is becoming, in my view, something that is likely to become, or is on the verge of becoming a rather serious issue, which is the persistence of the regional differences in India. So regional differences, when they existed, you had an idea of addressing them after independence. The persistence of these for such a long period of time, where you can see a clear difference between, say, southern India and western India and eastern and most parts of northern India. You can see there's a huge difference. So, states have per capita state GSDPs, which are net domestic products, which are less than 50% of the all India average. And there are others, even if you leave aside the city states, there are others who are more than double. So it's a huge gap that exists within. And what is also happening is that the population of India is growing faster in the ones which have the lower numbers. So their share in the Indian population is increasing. And the strains this is causing in India's federal system are already visible in the already emerging issue that the more advanced states are raising that we are contributing to the central taxes more. But because you are allocating based on population criteria, the allocation tends to be biased against us because our populations are not growing, so we are paying a price for our own development. Now this will also become a bigger issue once you have the next delimitation, because representation in the Lok Sabha, the legislature, is supposed to be based on population. And this would mean that the more advanced parts of the country, the south, and the west, their share would tend to come down and the other states would increase. So this is likely to become an issue which will cause major strains in India's federal system if this is not addressed quickly. The implication of this extremely high level of inequality, both internationally as domestically, on India's 90% of India's population is that even some of the most basic indicator of the level of development, which is the amount of food that you get to eat or consume, you find that India, which is supposedly self-sufficient in food and therefore is a net exporter of food to the rest of the world. Okay, if you look at the average dietary energy supply per capita, India is in the bottom row. And if you look upwards, only Africa is comparable to India. Everywhere in the world it is higher than, everywhere else it is higher than India. The Asian average is also higher than India's. So one of the reflections of the income status of large sections of the Indian population is the consumption level of food that you see. Okay. And if that consumption level of food itself is so low, this is not surprising, which is that they don't have too much to spend on manufactured products. So large number of manufactured products, consumer durables, etc., their level of penetration in the Indian population is extremely low. This is of course based on the 2011 census, which is the last one that was available, but if you look at the production of most of these commodities over the last 10 years, nothing much would have changed as far as this picture is concerned. There's only one manufactured product which has wide penetration in the Indian population, and that is mobile phones. Okay, that's the only product. Otherwise, so basically the market for manufactured products in India is very narrow, limited to a small section of the population. Now, what is the significance of that comes from the fact that if you look at India's the status amongst along on the industrialization index, okay, you find that India is in the category of middle income industrializing economies. So if you look at manufacturing value added per capita in India, okay, it is 330 here, 320 is the average for middle income industrializing economies. You look at the manufacturing share in GDP, you look at the manufacturing share in employment, okay. And in this you can see a pattern that in the movement from middle income to high income, you first, when you go from middle income to, this is cross section, but it is capturing a trend that happens over time, which is that when you go from middle income to middle income industrial economies, manufacturing value added per capita increases and the share of manufacturing in the economy, both in GDP as well as employment, is higher. And then manufacturing value added per capita goes on increasing even when you move to high income status. But the share of manufacturing in employment and GDP declines because they become more service oriented economies. So if you take the totality of all these three, India still has to go up the manufacturing value added per capita before it can be an industrialized economy. Long distance there to go. And therefore the share of manufacturing value added in GDP as well as employment should also be increasing. Okay? That's the direction it should go in. But what is happening is the opposite. So India is not part of the general Asian trend, where we are today in a context in which the whole world is deindustrializing. The advanced economies are deindustrializing, the low-income economies are deindustrializing, many of the lower middle income and upper middle income economies are also deindustrializing. The only region of the world which has defied this trend is basically East and Southeast Asia, not India. India is part of the trend of deindustrialization, and India here again is very similar to Africa, because the point at which that deindustrialization is happening, meaning that the share of manufacturing in both production as well as employment is tending to decline. Extremely low in India when you compare it with the advanced economies. So before having gone that path, it has already started deindustrializing. Okay. And you can see it here in terms of manufacturing share in GDP as well as in employment. You see now this declining trend. If you look at the actual growth of manufacturing output, and if you take the volume measure, which is the index of industrial production, you find that something which somehow nobody seems to be saying, which is that India has already experienced its second decade of industrial stagnation. We all know about the 66 to 75 decade as the decade of industrial stagnation. Big debate, world famous debate on industrial stagnation in India took place. But look at the growth rate of manufacturing, since 11-12. It's no different. Why was that stagnation and not this? Where is the debate? Where is even the acknowledgement that India is experiencing stagnation? Industrial stagnation. And if you stretch that to the present, this was till 1920. You stretch that to the present, the red curve tells you what the index of industrial production should have been like if it was growing steadily at 3.6%. And the blue one is the actual one. And you can see it still remains below that trend. So, this is more than a decade of industrial stagnation. Again, something that is there in the data. None of this is my data, this is all official data, but something not recognized. So what has actually happened is that if you look at India's insertion into the process of globalization, okay, so if you compare India with the rest of Asia, and particularly East and Southeast Asia, okay, and especially if you look at the trade in manufactures. So India has never emerged as a significant, though its share in world exports has increased, okay, it has never emerged as a significant exporter of manufactured products to the rest of the world. Now what does that mean? That you are neither an exporter and you neither have a large domestic market because your income growth is concentrated in the top 10% of the population. So neither of the sources of two potential sources of demand that could drive your industrial growth are present. Okay. If you also then look at what has happened to imports, you see an additional picture that India's share in world exports has increased, but its share in world imports has increased even more. And as far as manufacturing is concerned, India tends to have a deficit. Whereas the ones which have beaten the deindustrialization trend are all net exporters of manufacturing products. So there's a difference between the way India is inserted into the globalization process and that of these other Asian economies. That their share in world imports has increased, but not to the same extent as their exports have increased. And China is of course a prominent case of that. Okay. So the world's manufacturing activity, there's a shift in the pattern of that from the advanced economies towards Asia. But the main beneficiaries of that shift have been East and Southeast Asia and not India. A lot of this shift is also driven by foreign investment, which is in the search for cheapest locations to produce for the world market. Foreign investment shifts the geography of world production under globalization. The whole world is open to capital flows as well as trade flows. If you look at the FDI into India, okay, and this is not from what is called FDI in the statistics, this is when it's actually invested, does it appear to be a FDI or not. And if you look at this, so significant part of the FDI that has come to India has gone into manufacturing, more than half. You see the share of manufacturing in is more than 50%. Okay. Compare that with what has happened in IT services, which is information and communication. Below, much less has come into the IT activity. However, if you look at the nature of the activities of these entities, so if you look at manufacturing, what you find is, firstly look at the last column, they import more than they export. So the ratio of exports to imports is less than 100%. Okay. So there have been mechanisms of import-oriented insertion of India into global production systems. Okay. Then you see that within this, their purchases, the share of imports is quite high. And however, within their sales, the share of exports is And if you look at exports by FDI entities into India, those who have come into India, if they're exports from India, you find that the share of manufacturing FDI companies in exports is low, in imports is high, compared to their share in the investment. Whereas, if you look at the IT sector, that sector accounts for more than half the exports generated by FDI entities in India. So, India's insertion has not been based on manufacturing being into globalization, has not been based on centered on manufacturing, India becoming an important location of production of manufactured products for the world market. Even in services, it is not generally true. It's restricted or limited to one particular category of services, which is IT services, where of course India has emerged as a significant location for production of such services. I think this has gone missing for some reason. This is basically giving the picture about the shift in the patterns of world manufacturing activity. So there's a shift towards Asia, in which India has also participated, but India's share is extremely low compared to. So that means India is not exporting significantly to the world. It is not producing significantly within its own economy, and it is not importing either, significantly either. What that means is basically Indians' consumption of manufactured products per capita is extremely low. Okay, and if you can't export, if you can't sell domestically, and if you the buyers are not buying manufactured products on the basis of imports either, what does that mean? It means that they simply don't have the means to buy those products. Where India's trade relations have actually reflected the shift in the geography of world manufacturing has been in India's trade. Okay. So, in the beginning of the 90s, 2/3 of India's trade deficit was accounted for by the advanced OECD economies. That's disappeared. What has happened is that the Asian developing countries have replaced them as the source of India's trade deficit. And if you further break this down and look at in relation to individual countries, you find a pattern that India's trade relations with the relatively more industrial economies, whether developed or developing, tends to be characterized by a deficit. So it's deficit with Germany, deficit with Japan, amongst the advanced economies, and of course deficit with most of the East and Southeast Asian economies also. So the more industrial an economy tends to be, India's trade tends to be deficit with them. The more service-oriented economies like the United States is with whom India has a surplus. Okay. So United States is the largest contributor to this, to the surplus that India has. This is added to by the fact that if you look at how India's balance of payment situation has been, India has been, because of its trade deficit, consistently had a current account deficit. So India is a net capital importer. Its liabilities to the rest of the world have been continuously increasing. Okay. But it has been moderated by the fact that part of the trade deficit is cancelled out by India's invisible surplus. And the invisible surplus comes from either export of IT services or remittances from Indians working abroad. Kerala is of course familiar with remittances. So these two sources significantly neutralize India's trade deficit. Now if you look at the sources of these, I don't know why this is happening. PDF file shouldn't normally. Anyway, so if you look at the sources, destinations of India's services exports, again, United States is the leader. In the United States, Europe, the Western OECD economies account for the 80% of the market for India's services exports. So again, the more service-oriented economies are the one on whom India is reliant for this. If you look at remittances into India, the remittances also come from the West, either West Asia or the West beyond. Okay, mostly, not so much from Asia. So the goods come from Asia. Okay, and you're not able to sell goods to the rest of Asia on a significant scale. So the deficit there is being neutralized by exports, surpluses through exports of goods and services and remittances that you generate in your transactions towards the West. So the deficit with the East is compensated or offset by surplus in relation to the West. Now this acquires a certain significance because it means, where does India go? In a world in which this changed geography of world production has also heightened geopolitical tensions between East and West. Okay, between East and West. That's one of the new features of the present context. So the conditions under which globalization first took place in part have been undermined by the very results that globalization produced. So now it's difficult to imagine a condition in which the world's countries are going to act together on anything, whether it's climate or anything. You have trade wars emerging. So there is now a geopolitical conflict that is emerging, and India's location is rather in this peculiar position. There is a deficit with the East, and which are offset by surpluses with the West. The crisis of the global economy or globalization itself is also reflected in the pace of growth of India's external transactions. So if you look at the first decade of the 21st century, which includes the period of that boom before the 2008 crisis. So if you look at exports, imports as well as invisibles, all three grow in dollar terms, those are the bold lines. Captures how taking the first year to be the base year as 100. These are indices being compared with the first year of that period being serving as the base year. So the bold lines tell you how they grew in the period from 2001 to 2011-12. The dashed lines are telling you how they've grown since 11-12. So you can see that this itself is stagnating. Okay. So you already know industrialization is not the engine driving Indian growth. Trade is not the engine driving Indian growth either. Now come to the third story, which is investment. Again, this is a comparison between the first decade and the period after 2011-12. You can see a significant slowing down of the investment in the economy. But in the previous decade, first decade you had fairly rapid growth of investment. But since 11-12, the trend has been of much slower growth in capital formation for investment. And if you look at it relative to GDP, the investment ratio in India, after having increased first in the period before the 2008 crisis, dramatically increased, has been on a downward trajectory. Okay. So, if you remember what we want to call a bastardized version of the Hackdamar growth model, G equal to H like C. So the investment ratio becomes important in as far as the growth is concerned. That investment ratio is also, in the Indian case, declining. Okay. So now the investment ratio declining, of course, means that capital wealth accumulation is also not going in directions which would lead to productive investments. That form of accumulation of wealth is not particularly predominant. But that doesn't mean that it is changing the character of distribution of wealth in the country. So the top 10% accounts for the bulk of the wealth in this country. Now this is based on a certain conception of wealth which includes housing property as also wealth, which of course almost every Indian has, at least in their village home. So something is there. This doesn't fully capture the level of inequality. If you look at this, you see that the level of wealth inequality is much higher and increasing. It's been increasing over time. And on the other side, and this concentration in the ownership of wealth is further concentrated in the corporate sector. I'm not a defender of the corporate sector, because many people's wealth is then concentrated in the hands of relatively small number of business families. So the control over the wealth is far more concentrated than the ownership is. Ownership itself is very concentrated. Control over it is very highly concentrated. That while there are more than 9 lakh companies here filing income tax returns, barely 400 of them account for the bulk of the profits that these companies make.
Patrimonial capital.
Yeah, exactly. Now, so there is a problem with capital accumulation itself, that the pace of capital accumulation is slow. Within that process of capital accumulation, there is another tendency that has been created by the technological effects and their transmission in the world economy and then transmission to India, which is that you have a very rapid process of cheapening, relative cheapening of capital goods. Okay. And what this particular graph is indicating, that means that even if real wages are constant, do not increase, even then labor becomes relatively more expensive. Because the real wages are following, the real maintenance of the real wage means wage has to follow the trends in food prices. Food prices have increased relatively, capital goods have cheapened relatively. So even if you maintain the real wage in terms of the buying power of that wage constant, capital goods become relatively cheaper. So this means there is a strong tendency imparted in the economy to do that capital accumulation process where it is labor substituting in capital. Labor substituting tendency is imparted into by this particular trend, long-term trend that one has seen in relative movements of capital goods and food prices. In addition to that is that the capital formation process in the economy, particularly of the corporate sector, is also changing in character. The machinery and equipment component is quickly coming down. So one part that is increased is construction. Okay. And the other is intellectual property products, which is basically investment in software. So investment in software, which again too has a labor substituting kind of character, is an additional feature of the, increasingly a feature of capital formation in India. So therefore, capital accumulation already slow. If that is also characterized by this labor substituting character, then capital accumulation process is, prospects of that generating employment are extremely poor. And till 2017-18, you saw some of the effects of this in the form of a decline in the work participation rate, the proportion of the Indian population which is actually employed. Since the PLFS started coming in 2017-18, suddenly there is an increase in employment. You see there's a reversal of that trend and the work participation rate has suddenly gone up. But look at the structure of that employment. Look at the first column. Return to agriculture. It's not manufacturing, it's not services, it is agriculture. Okay, where the share of employment, the share in employment is increased. If you look at the numbers, okay, you find that the increase is supposed to be based on much greater increase in work participation of women historically those whose work participation has been low than in the case of men. Okay. Bulk of the increase in employment is in rural India, significant parts in agriculture, and almost entirely in the increase in self-employment, not wage employment. Half of that self-employment is helper in a household enterprise. So this is perhaps more a reflection of distress employment than real increase in employment, and confirming that is the picture as far as the growth of earnings are concerned. So if you look at the bottom rows, you see that the same PLFS data, when it shows figures of earnings from this employment, all the employment categories, the rate percentage increase over this period from 17-18 to 22-23 is less than the increase in the price level. So all of them in real terms have come down. If you look at the category where the biggest increase in employment has happened, self-employment, even in nominal terms it has come down. So if you look at the real earnings of all the self-employed in 22-23, much larger number of self-employed, and compare them with the fewer number of self-employed in 2017-18, you find that all these more people self-employed are earning together less than the smaller number did in 2019. So this is not employment that is associated with any kind of increase in earnings. So and this is what is the final result of it in terms of earnings. That but before I go, I also wanted to look at the top 3 rows. So the figures in the brackets are based on the RBI claims databases estimates. The other figures are my own estimates derived from PLFS and National Account Statistics, but they both show the same story. Solar would be turning in his grave. What is this happening? Y is growing less than both L and K. Okay. The increase in real output is less than the percentage increase in employment and the percentage increase in capital stock. So both labor productivity as well as capital productivity are declining. It would be a very peculiar odd growth process to generate this kind of a trend. And this then is the state of those earnings. So from different sources you look, you can get a picture that the average earnings of those in India who have to earn from work are extremely low. The category which is highest in India's total employment. They push up the average because there the salary level is higher. But in general, you don't have the scope for any significant earnings from work available to the large section of the Indian population, and therefore their income level also remains low because they don't have the wealth and they don't have earnings from work. Now, any process of trying to counter this through public expenditure, government expenditure, of course, that's not happening. Instead, we have a trend where the expenditure trend is downwards through most of the liberalization period, because you are following this policy that taxes have to be low and fiscal deficit has to be low. So it's become like an iron law now, where even major crises like COVID do not induce a shift from that kind of an approach. But that's like an iron law that is being followed. So this cycle cannot be broken through interventions that are based on stepping up of public expenditure, which could generate employment, which could generate demand and break that particular cycle that you have in the economy. What you're then left with in terms of development activity by the state, development policy, is this: that because you have faster per capita GDP growth as compared to earnings from work, even if the tax to GDP ratio remains constant, government becomes richer relative to the poor. It doesn't become richer relative to the rich, but it becomes richer relative to the poor. Okay. So, in comparison to the income that people are earning from work, it is possible for the significance of different kinds of state support relatively to increase. So some bit of this increase in revenue, the state sharing in the increased inequalities, the benefit that state gets of increased inequalities in terms of revenue, okay, that being the basis for some kind of support. This is what development policy essentially in India has now got reduced to. And there's of course a whole kind of politics that has grown around that particular thing. So, to conclude, if the growth trajectory is one which is caught in this vicious cycle, that 90% of the population is stuck in conditions of mass unemployment, underemployment, or low earnings, your market is very narrowly based. The expression of that you see most in manufacturing. So you don't have a domestic market-based growth of manufacturing, you don't have an export market-based growth of manufacturing. Because you don't have that, you have no basis on which investment can be sustained. And the slowing down of investment then adds to the problem of demand, because investment is also a manufacturing intensive expenditure. So you are firmly on that path to deindustrialization, because there is no basis for deindustrialization. And the top 10% can grow on the basis of its own expenditure, but that leads to some kind of growth of services which also do not generate significant employment. So you are stuck in that particular situation, and any scope for escaping from that on the basis of intervention in the form of public expenditure stepping up, that is ruled out by the conditions of the present. And unfortunately, the political economy of this whole process is also working at the moment to largely perpetuate these conditions rather than to force any change. But unless this changes, it's very hard to imagine how India's economy will move to developed status. 10%, some of them have gone well beyond developed status. That's a different matter. For 90%, there's very little prospect that this offers for any movement towards development. In fact, it means stagnation or perhaps worse as the only future, unless there is some change in it. But those conditions from them can also spring forces to change. So we hope that something like that will happen. Thank you.
The students can ask some questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for delivering an insightful keynote address. Now, the floor is open for discussion. Good afternoon. My name is Alina Priya. I'm a second year MA Economics student in the Department of Economics. I'd like to ask a question to Surajit sir. You have mentioned about the situation of India, especially the manufacturing sector, and it is lagging behind, and we are in the second decade of industrial stagnation. My question is, why India is losing the momentum in the case of manufacturing sector? Even though we have initiatives like Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, or something like, we have FDI flows too. So itself pointed out that FDI is increasing in India in the case of manufacturing sector, but we have more imports than exports. What's the actual problem why India is not rising in the case of manufacturing sector? We succeed in the case of service but fail in case of manufacturing. Why is it so? And what are the possible way forward that you can suggest in order to rectify this particular situation?
I think I'd first like to clarify in saying that it's not true that we are a services success. So the reason that the shift towards services that follows a process of industrialization in any economy is one in which it is led by employment, which is that you have a shift of employment and output follows. So if you look at any advanced economy in the world today, more than 70% of their employment is in services. India is a country in which the share of services in GDP has crossed 60%, but its share in employment is 30% and declining. Okay, so it's not the same thing as that is not that you are having services doing what industrialization did in the case of other economies. Even in the case of exports of services, it is only one specific category of services in which India has achieved this success for various historical reasons. That's a separate discussion about what exactly is the reason, but it's limited to one single category of services. You take out IT and you look at other services, India's position is still the same. It's a deficit in most other services. So first, that's part. The second is as far as industrialization is concerned. If you are going to industrialize, obviously, of course, one of the essential requirements is that you need a correspondingly expanding market for industrial products. If you're going to grow rapidly, the industrial sector is to grow rapidly, you need a corresponding growth in the market for industrial products. Okay. Now, partly that can be created out of that industrialization process itself. That we are industrializing, you have to build new plants, new factories, new machinery is to be installed. So the investment within that sector itself creates part of the demand for those products. The rest of the demand is to come from either domestic market for consumption goods or export markets. In the case of export markets, you have to be able to find those markets. In order to be able to find those markets, either you have some political means to get access to some market, which India of course never had. It's not a colonial power, it doesn't have the kind of basis on which to have access to even the kind of advantages that countries like Korea and Taiwan had because of geopolitical considerations, access to export markets. India has not had that in the past, and under globalization, of course, it's not. That's not the basis on which you will find access to export markets. Under globalization, it is basically you have to be competitive in relation to production for the world market. That is relative to other territories to which production could go. Production itself is mobile across countries. Capital flows and good flows make it mobile. Production goes wherever it is cheapest to produce. So India's historical development of India's manufacturing sector, infrastructure conditions, even on labor conditions. Okay. I mean, because there are limits to what productivity you can get out of labor who pay so poorly. Okay. So all of these conditions have meant that in India, largely in the whole range of manufacturing products is not competitive as far as production for the world market is concerned. Of course, you are a large country, so it's very difficult for everything to be produced outside and being imported into India. Okay, so there is some basis for domestic production, and in some cases, some of your infrastructure constraints matter. So imports become costlier because you don't have the infrastructure to import. Domestic production can still be competitive as far as to some extent. So within the confines of whatever that the domestic market permits, you can have industrial. So what you get in India is so you have a large population. So if you look at individual industries, we are the world's second largest producer of steel. We are the world's second largest producer of cement. But that's because the first in all of these is way ahead of us, and the next is only slightly behind us because they have a much smaller population. So the United States is the next in line, 4% of the world's population, less than 4% of the world's population. India and China, 18% of the world's population. So we are the world's largest producer of, second largest cement, second largest steel, fourth largest refiner, almost the largest producer of motorcycles in the world, because we have a large population. But despite the ability, therefore, to produce on such scale, you are not being able to be competitive as far as the international market is concerned, because all other complementary conditions are missing. And if you don't have any policy interventions to create those conditions, you will never be competitive. You can never become competitive. So we are continuously relying on the fond hope that we will be the next China, because Chinese wages have gone up, and therefore our cheap labor advantage will become more decisive. Unfortunately, it's not happening, and you also have to take into account that those who moved production to China are not going to be the movers who are going to be there today. So even when we want to promote Make in India and we want to encourage FDI, who comes to India? Chinese firms. And then we have problems with them. Okay. So because they have taken over so much a part of the production in the world, so they will be the ones to move, not the ones who moved it originally. So even if we have good relations with the West, better relations with the West, that doesn't make us a favored destination as far as production is concerned. So essentially, none of the ingredients necessary to drive an industrialization process exist here. Now you cannot create overnight in any way conditions which will enable you to be competitive internationally. But you can have measures which improve your domestic market conditions. And the same processes can also in time create conditions where you will be more competitive internationally. Then it could be possible. But if you restrict yourself to a policy where market will take care of everything, this is what you will get. Yes.
So if we say that development policies in India is now being focused towards the direction of central sector schemes, all the PM yojanas and schemes, and in that regard we know that because India is a very diverse economy and states are at different process of development, several states are in a very disadvantaged position. The guidelines are common. For example, in the case of Kerala, in several cases we are not able to follow the guidelines. Maybe 30% of the project fund will be for training. And
Go ahead, ask questions to me. Extract the both.
what is your take on that?
Yeah, so I do, in fact, if you look at two parts of what I said, there is one part is that this is what is becoming as far as, and of course there is a problem that the amount available, when it has to be shared, there are competing issues. The highly centralized structure of revenue generation also in India creates a problem that states also have to depend not just on the state share in central taxes, but also now a significant amount of transfers of funds which are earmarked by the center but may be actually spent through the state. So naturally in a diverse country like India, yes, there would be problems, but the diversity in India, as you were saying, is, of course, we were always a very special, unique country in terms of our linguistic and cultural diversity. I mean, even China is not diverse like India. Only other country which is comparable in size to India. But we also have significant economic diversity. And addressing both these diversities through such a centralized structure is bound to run into problems. And this is only an added dimension, what you mentioned is an added dimension to these tensions that the federal system is increasingly facing. Okay. Because it is difficult, okay. You can't keep telling people, after all, even those who are more developed than the rest, who have significant populations who are deprived. You can't keep telling them you are less deprived than your counterparts in Myanmar, therefore you should wait 30 years to get this benefit. It's very difficult to do that. So, the demands or conditions in different states both reflect their own levels of development, and also the fact that every part of India also reflects this larger pattern of inequality. You can't escape from that. That larger pattern of inequality has its expressions in every state in different ways. So there are development needs everywhere, whether they are more advanced in per capita terms or less advanced, there are development needs everywhere. And then these persistent development needs come into conflict with all the principles of equity that you follow as far as the allocation of resources. Now, of course, a lot of this could be addressed if you could increase the quantum of resources that were available. But that's not happening because you're constrained to follow a policy of low taxes and low fiscal deficit. So the pool that is available to be distributed itself becomes small. And therefore, the more stringent conditions in terms of how you can use those funds. The less the funds are, the greater are also the conditionalities that become with. Sometimes the conditionalities themselves are in relation to whether you should spend at all or not, how much you can spend. So they do cause certain strains and tensions, but the resolution of these through increased centralization is in a sense only aggravating the underlying crisis. That would be the way I would.
The last point you were making that, given the constant tax to GDP ratio, the government has the leeway to give freebies and go over their political agendas and so on. And at least for the last 2 or 3 fiscals, at least the union government is focusing more on capex, capital expenditure. How do you think this capital expenditure going to solve some of the problems you are saying? Like, let's say, increase the productivity of labor or it adds to certain infrastructure that would prompt more investment and activity. And do you see such a prospect? This is the first question. Then the second. Yeah. Then the second is like, all the data was there on your PPT except for the foreign exchange, perhaps, because the very point for turning to globalization was we were running low on foreign exchange and we were facing balance of payment prices and so on and so forth. But now we have a great sum of foreign exchange, I believe. At least it solved that problem, I guess.
I'll answer that. So firstly, let me clarify. I wouldn't use the term freebies.
No, yeah.
Okay. And the reason being that firstly, it's a myth to say that the poor in this country don't contribute tax revenues, because we have a significant dependence in India on indirect tax revenues, which are borne by every section of the population. So it's not that they do not contribute to the tax revenues. Secondly, the income from which the state receives the taxes, okay, may belong by law to those who have higher incomes, but in the generation of that, those who are on the other side of that divide have also played their part. Okay, so it's just how the balance has worked out that they don't have. So the resources that are being spent, if at all, on them are resources that they have contributed to making. It's not freebie in that sense. Secondly, what I was saying was that that's all that is left in terms of doing development. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's a lot. And the conditions, there are fiscal limits to what you can do, so that you can do a lot in that. And secondly, there are other limits in the sense that if you want to maintain your low wage economy status, that is, if you want to maintain conditions where cheap labor is going to be available, then after all, if the alternative is between working, slogging yourself for 14-15 hours a day and making 5,000 rupees a month, and you have the option of getting 5,000 rupees a month from the state and not do any work, who will work then? Okay. So the logic of the system will not allow it to go beyond a point. And you can see reflections of that. So in 2019 you said we will give 500 rupees a month to farmers because of the particular condition that I was at that time. Even today it is 500 rupees. Even though prices have gone up. So it's not that a lot is happening, but what all I was saying was that that's all that has remained as far as development interventions are concerned, because the larger macro processes are not things in which you are willing to intervene. Now, as far as your
Capex.
Yeah, capex is concerned, my opinion, I have discussed this when I had the lectures on the budget, which is that the capex thing is a bit of a myth. Because I showed you a figure about public expenditure, which includes public investment. Now, public investment includes not just investment out of the government budget, but also by public enterprises. Okay. Now, if you look at the combined figure, there is no increase stepping up of capital expenditure that has happened. Okay. So basically, public sector enterprises that make a profit, you take that into your budget as non-tax revenue, the dividends paid by public enterprises, because government is the shareholder. On the expenditure side, you spend on the government budget, and the investment out of the internal resources of public enterprises, that comes down. So you don't get actually such a high level of capital expenditure. Yes, there is a mindset that you don't spend on revenue, but you spend on capital expenditure, and this comes from an understanding that capital expenditure is productive, it generates a return, revenue does not. But capital expenditure and revenue expenditure are accounting terms. So if you pay salary to doctors or nurses or to teachers, that is under revenue expenditure. You construct a building, that is capital expenditure. Now we've seen so many of these times that you do capital expenditure, it produces no return. During COVID, you had state after state having this picture. Okay. Where you had hospitals, ventilators, no doctors and nurses. So, capital expenditure of this kind doesn't necessarily have that productive. So, one is capital expenditure, public capital expenditure is not going up. Okay. And all that is happening is a change in the orientation of that expenditure, where a large part of it is basically going to build roads and highways. But the roads and highways are also being built in this country where you bypass the bulk of the population of the country. Either go above or like this. So you're building roads and highways, but it's not necessarily creating conditions of economic connectivity for large sections of the population. And ultimately you need things to be able to move on roads and highways. So the rich can drive in their cars on the roads and highways, but it's not really making a significant difference to the average productivity in the economy or levels of economic activity. Okay. About your foreign exchange reserves, just one small thing. Foreign exchange reserves, we have a current account deficit. So we are not earning excess foreign currency. But because foreigners come and invest in India, and they are not doing productive investment, minus the financial investment. So excess of those flows over your deficit is the way in which you are accumulating foreign exchange reserves. So foreign exchange reserves are a low return asset